The air was still, the kind of bone-chilling stillness that only comes with the most brutal winter mornings. In the remote valleys of Montana, the thermometer outside Jack Miller's cabin read an unimaginable -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Icy winds sliced through the forest, howling like restless spirits as snow blanketed the rugged wilderness. The world seemed frozen, both literally and figuratively. Inside his small wooden cabin, Jack, a solitary wildlife photographer in his late 40s, poured himself a steaming cup of coffee. His hands were weathered from years spent chasing nature's raw beauty, but his soul thrived in these isolated moments. As he settled into his chair by the frosted window, he savored the quiet, the sort of quiet that felt sacred in a world so loud elsewhere. This was his ritual, mornings spent watching the world awaken. A red fox might dart across the snow, or a pair of elk might emerge from the tree line, their breath visible in the icy air. Today, though, the wilderness appeared deserted, consumed by the merciless cold. Jack sighed, gazing out the window, appreciating the stark beauty of the barren, white world. Then he saw it, a shadow, massive and moving. His pulse quickened. The shadow grew larger, and suddenly it emerged into view. Standing just beyond his frost-covered window was a grizzly bear, her towering frame coated in ice. Jack froze, his coffee cup suspended mid-air, the steam curling upward like ghostly tendrils. This was no ordinary encounter. Behind her, 3 small cubs huddled together, trembling violently in the snow. One of them collapsed, its tiny body nearly motionless, swallowed by the cruel winter. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Bears in winter? They should be hibernating deep in their dens. Yet here they were, exposed to the killing cold. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Jack's hands trembled as he set his coffee cup down on the wooden table. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene outside. The grizzly bear, now close enough for him to see every detail, stood motionless, her massive form covered in frost and snow. Her fur, once thick and protective, was thin in places, exposing patches of her raw, weathered skin. She looked exhausted, her chest rising and falling heavily as if each breath was a battle. This wasn't the image of a fearsome predator. It was something entirely different, raw desperation embodied in the hulking figure of a creature pushed to the brink. Aurora. The name struck Jack like a sudden thought, unbidden but fitting. There was a faint beauty to her, even amidst the agony of her condition. But her beauty was overshadowed by the heartbreaking sight of the cubs behind her. The 2 cubs closest to Aurora were barely upright, their small bodies trembling violently. One leaned heavily against its sibling for support, its legs threatening to buckle under the strain of standing. But it was the smallest cub that shattered Jack's composure. The tiny creature lay sprawled in the snow, its body eerily still except for the faintest rise and fall of its chest. A sharp gust of wind swept across the scene, causing Aurora to flinch. She turned her head sharply to check on her fallen cub, then shifted her gaze back to Jack. Her eyes bore into his, dark, intelligent, pleading. Suddenly, Aurora moved closer. With a deliberate, measured motion, she lifted her paw and tapped against the window. The sound, muffled by the frost, was rhythmic, intentional. Jack's heart thudded in his chest. "What? What are you doing?" he muttered aloud, as if expecting an answer. Aurora tapped again, this time more firmly, as if urging him to understand. Her other paw hovered protectively near the cubs, her body shielding them from the worst of the relentless wind. Jack could see her shaking now, the cold visibly sapping what little strength she had left. Jack's instincts screamed at him to stay inside. He knew grizzlies were dangerous, unpredictable, especially a mother protecting her young. Yet Aurora's actions defied every instinct he associated with wildlife. She wasn't baring her teeth or pounding at the door in aggression. She wasn't foraging for food. No, she was begging. Jack's mind raced. Bears weren't supposed to behave like this, especially not in the dead of winter. His years of photographing wildlife had taught him to expect the unexpected. But this? This was something else entirely. Aurora's tapping stopped, She turned toward the smallest cub, nudging it gently with her nose. It didn't move. She froze, then whipped her head back toward Jack, her expression growing more urgent. With deliberate care, she lowered herself onto her haunches, her massive frame trembling, and raised both front paws in a gesture that was disturbingly human-like, a silent plea. Jack's chest tightened. This wasn't natural. This wasn't instinct. This was communication, raw and undeniable. He stood frozen, torn between his fear of what might happen if he intervened and the overwhelming compassion welling up inside him. The smallest cub wasn't going to survive much longer. He could see it. He could feel it. Aurora tapped the window one final time, her paw lingering against the glass as she held his gaze. The message was clear. Help us. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away from the window, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. What could he do? What should he do? Outside, Aurora waited. The two trembling cubs pressed against her side as she lowered her head and nuzzled the motionless form of the smallest, her every action filled with heartbreaking tenderness. Jack's hand hovered over the doorknob, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the howling wind. His breath formed small clouds in the freezing air of the cabin, and he tried to steady his racing thoughts. Outside, Aurora's actions became even more deliberate, as if sensing the urgency of the moment. The massive grizzly shifted her weight, her body a wall of strength yet visibly weakened by the unforgiving cold. Slowly she lowered her head and picked up the smallest cub in her jaws. The tiny creature hung limp, its fur stiff with ice, its breaths shallow and sporadic. Aurora approached the window, carefully cradling the cub against the frosted glass. A low, mournful sound escaped her throat, a sound Jack couldn't have imagined coming from a bear. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was a plea. Aurora's dark eyes bore into his, shimmering with what could only be described as desperation. She held the cub against the glass, as though trying to show him the fragile life slipping away. Then she glanced back at the two remaining cubs, huddled tightly together in a futile attempt to share warmth, their trembling bodies barely upright. The sight twisted something deep inside Jack, but his fear held him rooted in place. This isn't natural, he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize the extraordinary scene. Bears were supposed to act on instinct, not logic or emotion, or so he had believed. Aurora placed the smallest cub gently back in the snow, then turned back toward Jack. She straightened herself and sat back on her haunches, her massive form looming like a silent sentinel against the blinding white backdrop. Slowly, deliberately, she raised both front paws and held them together in front of her chest. Jack blinked, sure he was imagining things. The posture was unmistakable, prayer-like, deliberate, and profoundly human. He gasped audibly, his knees weak. Aurora didn't move, her gaze unwavering, as though silently urging him to act. Her two standing cubs whimpered softly, the sound barely audible over the wind, but enough to shatter the silence in Jack's mind. Then it happened. The middle cub, the one leaning heavily on its sibling, crumpled to the ground. The snow around its small body puffed upward as it fell, unmoving. Aurora spun around, frantic. She nudged the cub with her nose, her breath forming desperate puffs in the icy air. The cub didn't respond. She let out a guttural sound, filled with anguish, then whipped her head back toward Jack. Inside the cabin, Jack felt his chest tighten. His thoughts raced. What if I let them in, and it goes wrong? What if they attack? What if I don't help, and they die right in front of me? Aurora returned to the window, tapping on the glass harder this time, her claws creating rhythmic sounds that sent chills down Jack's spine. She alternated between pointing at her cubs with her muzzle and looking directly at him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I can't just do nothing," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The smallest cub lay motionless, its fragile body fading fast. The middle cub was now struggling to breathe, and Aurora's increasing desperation painted an unbearable picture. Jack's hand trembled as it rested on the cold metal latch of the cabin door. The weight of his decision bore down on him, every rational thought waging war against the instinctual compassion rising within him. He knew what this could mean. Letting a massive predator and her cubs so close was a risk no seasoned wildlife photographer would take lightly. Yet the sight of Aurora's prayer-like gestures and her desperate eyes made retreat feel impossible. With a deep breath, he turned the latch. The door creaked open slightly, the icy wind immediately cutting through the warmth of the cabin. Jack shivered, not only from the cold, but from the tension coursing through his veins. He squinted into the blinding white light outside, his heart pounding as he assessed the scene just beyond the threshold. Aurora was still sitting back on her haunches, her enormous frame covered in frost. She seemed to sense the shift in Jack's demeanor as the door opened. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself and nudged the smallest cub with her nose. The tiny creature lay limp in the snow, its breaths faint and labored. Aurora grasped it gently in her jaws and moved toward the doorway. Jack's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to slam the door shut. But he stood firm, his breath visible in the cold as he watched the mother bear approach. Aurora stopped just short of the door, her dark eyes meeting Jack's through the narrow opening. She paused, her movements careful and measured. Then, as if understanding the unspoken boundaries, she placed the cub down gently just inside the cabin's threshold. Jack's eyes darted between the cub and Aurora. She stepped back immediately, retreating to where her two other cubs waited, huddled together against the bitter wind. Aurora's gaze never wavered, her eyes filled with a kind of trust Jack couldn't fully comprehend. His hands moved instinctively as he crouched down to pick up the smallest cub. The moment he touched its frail body, a wave of urgency surged through him. The cub's fur was stiff with ice, its small chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Jack cradled it close, his mind racing. "You're freezing," he murmured, his voice breaking. Aurora remained outside, watching intently but making no move to follow him in. Her posture was calm, almost deferential, as though she understood that this moment required Jack's full attention. She kept her other cubs close, shielding them from the elements with her massive body. Jack shut the door quickly, cutting off the harsh wind. Inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around him and the tiny cub in his arms. He grabbed a thick blanket from the couch and carefully swaddled the cub, its tiny form dwarfed by the fabric. He could feel the cub's body trembling weakly, its small heart fluttering against his hands like a trapped bird. "Hang in there," he whispered, carrying the cub toward the fire. He placed it on a soft cushion near the hearth, the heat radiating toward its frozen limbs. Jack turned back toward the door, his thoughts racing. Aurora was still out there, patiently waiting in the relentless cold, her eyes fixed on the cabin as if silently asking if she had done enough to save her child. The room was filled with the warmth of the fire, but Jack's heart raced with a mix of apprehension and awe as he turned toward the door. Aurora was still outside, standing resolutely with her two remaining cubs nestled close against her massive frame. The smallest cub, now swaddled in a blanket near the fireplace, had begun to stir faintly, its shallow breaths growing a fraction steadier. Jack hesitated before opening the door again. The blizzard roared outside, carrying sharp shards of snow into the cabin as he unlatched it. Aurora, sensing his gesture, stepped forward slowly, her every movement measured and deliberate. She glanced at the doorway and then at Jack, as though asking for permission to cross this invisible boundary. She nudged one of her cubs forward gently with her nose, encouraging it to step toward the cabin. The little cub stumbled, its tiny legs wobbling as it braved the cold. Jack held his breath as Aurora guided the cub toward the door, ensuring it made it inside safely before turning to the other. When the second cub was inside, Aurora paused. To Jack's astonishment, she lifted one of her massive paws and scraped it against the snow, brushing away clumps of ice and debris. She repeated the motion with the other paw before stepping up to the threshold, her eyes briefly meeting Jack's. It was a moment of quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of shared trust. Once inside, Aurora moved with surprising grace. Her enormous size could have made her a chaotic presence in the small cabin, but she carefully kept her distance from Jack and his belongings. Instead, She guided her cubs to a corner near the fire, where the smallest one lay wrapped in the blanket. She nudged her other cubs to huddle together, their tiny bodies pressing close for warmth. Jack stood motionless, watching the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and wonder. Aurora turned her attention to a nearby pile of old blankets he'd left near the couch. She sniffed at them briefly, then picked up one in her jaws with remarkable gentleness. Draping it over her cubs, she adjusted it until they were all covered, her actions precise and purposeful. It was as if she understood the object's purpose, not merely as a random item in the room, but as a tool to protect her cubs. Jack had seen animals display intelligence before, but this was something else entirely. Aurora then settled herself beside her cubs, curling her massive frame protectively around them. She glanced at Jack once more, her eyes soft but alert, as though assuring him she would respect his space. Jack felt a wave of emotions wash over him, relief, curiosity, and an unshakable sense of connection. He had always respected wildlife, but he had never imagined a moment like this. Aurora's actions weren't driven by wild instinct alone. There was a method, an awareness, an undeniable intelligence in everything she did. The warmth of the fire filled the cabin, soft and steady, as the storm outside howled against the wooden walls. Jack sat at the edge of his chair, his eyes fixed on the bear family nestled in the far corner of the room. Aurora lay protectively around her 3 cubs, her massive body curled into a barrier against the cold. The smallest cub, swaddled in Jack's old blanket, seemed to breathe more evenly now, its chest rising and falling in a calming rhythm. The other 2 cubs huddled close to their mother's side, their small forms relaxing under the comforting weight of the blanket Aurora had draped over them. Their trembling had subsided, replaced by the faint rhythmic sounds of their breathing. Jack watched, his earlier tension slowly dissolving into an almost meditative calm. Aurora glanced up at him, her dark eyes catching the firelight. The look she gave him was unlike anything he'd ever seen in an animal, neither fear nor threat, but something closer to gratitude. Jack felt the corner of his mouth twitch in a hesitant smile. He wasn't sure why, but her expression made him feel as though he'd done something profoundly right. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the silence. From beneath the couch came Mittens, Jack's black and white cat. The feline stretched languidly, her green eyes wide as she cautiously observed the new visitors in her territory. "Mittens, no," Jack whispered, his voice tinged with worry. The cat, unfazed by his warning, stepped out into the open, her tail twitching with curiosity. Aurora's ears twitched at the movement, and her head turned toward the small creature. Jack froze, his heart leaping into his throat. Aurora's reaction, however, was anything but aggressive. She lowered her massive head to the ground, resting it on her front paws. Her movements were deliberate, almost submissive, as though she understood the cat's fragile nature and sought to put it at ease. The cubs, noticing their mother's calm demeanor, lifted their heads and peered at the intruder with wide, curious eyes. They didn't move, merely watching with a mix of interest and caution. Mittens took a hesitant step forward, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Jack held his breath, ready to intervene if the situation turned dangerous, but Aurora remained perfectly still. The cat approached slowly, her paws silent against the wooden floor until she was mere inches from Aurora's nose. To Jack's astonishment, Mittens gave a soft, tentative meow. Aurora blinked, her massive frame utterly relaxed. The smallest cub let out a tiny whimper, and Mittens turned her head, almost as if acknowledging the sound. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The cabin had transformed into an unlikely sanctuary, where predator and prey coexisted in a fragile harmony. Jack marveled at the serenity that had settled over the room. The bears, once desperate and on the brink of collapse, now seemed at peace. The storm outside had finally begun to wane, leaving behind a world cloaked in deep, unbroken snow. Inside the cabin, a quiet stillness lingered as the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Aurora stirred first, her massive frame shifting gently to avoid disturbing her sleeping cubs. Jack, still seated by the fireplace, noticed the change immediately. He watched as Aurora nudged each of her cubs awake, her movements tender but purposeful. The smallest cub, once on the brink of death, opened its eyes fully and let out a soft, almost cheerful whimper. It was time. Aurora seemed to sense that the safety and warmth they had found in the cabin had served its purpose, and now they needed to return to the wilderness. Aurora stood and turned her gaze toward Jack. For a moment it felt as though she were silently communicating her intentions. Jack nodded instinctively, though his chest tightened with a strange mix of sadness and admiration. Before moving to the door, Aurora began to inspect the room. She moved carefully, her massive paws stepping lightly as she scanned every corner. It was almost as though she wanted to ensure she was leaving the space exactly as she'd found it. Her cubs mimicked her behavior, remaining close but avoiding any disruptions to the cabin. Finally, Aurora approached the door, her cubs trailing behind her in a neat line. Jack, sensing the moment's significance, stood and moved to open it. The biting cold swept in as the door creaked open, but Jack barely noticed. His attention was locked on the bear family, framed against the brilliant white backdrop of the snowy forest. Bear family, framed against the brilliant white backdrop of the snowy forest. What happened next left him breathless. Aurora turned to face him, her cubs forming a line at her side. One by one, each cub stepped forward. The smallest, still wrapped in Jack's old blanket, placed its tiny paw over its chest in a gesture so deliberate it could only be described as gratitude. It let out a soft whimper before stepping back. The second cub followed, adding a small bow to its gesture, and the largest finished with a faint, high-pitched sound that almost resembled a thank you. Then Aurora herself moved forward. Slowly she extended her massive paw and rested it lightly on Jack's arm. The warmth of her touch sent a shock of emotion through him. It wasn't just a touch. It was a moment laden with meaning, an unspoken acknowledgement of trust, gratitude, and connection. With one final glance, Aurora led her cubs out into the snow. Their exit was orderly and dignified, each cub following its mother closely. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Aurora paused, turned back, and looked at Jack one last time. She raised her paw in what could only be described as a wave. Jack stood frozen in the doorway, his chest tight and his eyes misty. He noticed Aurora using her paw to sweep away the snow at the cabin's threshold, leaving it clean and undisturbed. Then, without another sound, the family disappeared into the forest. As the last trace of Aurora and her cubs vanished into the snowy forest, Jack stood motionless in the open doorway. The biting cold pricked at his skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the single paw print left in the snow, its perfect outline a quiet testament to the extraordinary encounter that had just unfolded. The world outside was silent, the storm having passed, leaving a crystalline stillness in its wake. Inside, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just the warmth of the fire or the faint scent of fur lingering in the air. It was as if the room itself had absorbed the weight of what had transpired. Jack closed the door slowly, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't yet put into words. Leaning against the table, he replayed every moment, the desperate tapping on the window, the human-like gestures, the silent plea in Aurora's eyes. He had spent years documenting wildlife, capturing the raw beauty of nature through his lens. Yet this was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Aurora wasn't just a bear. She was a mother, a protector, and above all a sentient being capable of trust, gratitude, and connection. Jack's gaze returned to the paw print outside, now illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. It struck him as a symbol, not just of the bear's visit, but of something larger. It was a reminder of the fragile line between survival and extinction, between fear and understanding. Days later, as Jack reviewed the footage from his security cameras, he realized the power of the story he had captured. The videos showed every extraordinary detail: Aurora's careful approach, her gentle gestures, the cubs' coordinated goodbyes. Jack hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was something too sacred to share, but he knew the world needed to see it. When the footage was uploaded, it spread like wildfire. Wildlife experts, conservationists, and ordinary people were captivated. Scientists debated the implications of Aurora's behavior, questioning long-held beliefs about animal intelligence and emotional depth. News outlets described the encounter as a once-in-a-lifetime event that blurred the lines between human and animal consciousness. But for Jack, the experience was deeply personal. Standing in the doorway that day, watching Aurora disappear into the wild, he had felt something shift within himself. He saw the natural world not as a distant observer, but as a participant, intertwined with its delicate balance. He made a vow to honor what Aurora had taught him. He would use his voice, his photography, and his newfound understanding to advocate for coexistence, to remind others that the vulnerability of nature is, in many ways, a reflection of our own. The single paw print outside his cabin faded with the next snowfall, but its impact remained indelible in Jack's heart, and in the hearts of millions who heard the story. Did this story move you as much as it did for so many others? Can you feel the powerful connection between humans and nature, the shared vulnerability that ties us all together? If you were in Jack's shoes, what would you have done? Take a moment to reflect on Aurora's incredible journey and share your thoughts. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also brings us closer to creating stories that truly resonate. If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible tales like this one. Together, let's explore more stories that remind us of the beauty and wonder of the world around us. Thank you for joining us, and here's wishing you a wonderful day filled with inspiration and good fortune.